All right, let's go ahead and get on with the third module. Welcome to the third module. By now, you should have taken the second exam on chapters 6 and 3. And the third module will be about two definite chapters that go hand in hand, learning and memory. This will be the first of 3 lectures as we continue to split up the lectures as I would in class. And so today we will talk about what learning is, how the book defines learning, the different types of learning that we have, as well as going over the first type of learning called classical conditioning. This is something that should serve you very well in life as well as in this class. So here you can see today we're going over the basic concepts of learning as well as the first type, which is called classical conditioning. It is a type of unconscious learning. In the last chapter, chapter 3, we talked about conscious and unconscious processes in our brain. And classical conditioning is usually defined as the simplest form of learning. This occurs across all species. In the next exciting adventure, we will talk about operant conditioning. And in the third version of this, or third lecture of this chapter, we'll talk about biological constraints on conditioning, as well as the third, actually there's 4 types you'll see, but the third major sort of type of learning, which is called observational learning. Learning by observing others. We do this all the time, whether you realize it or not. So, again, at the beginning of the chapter, we always like to start with what is the definition of what we're talking about? So what is learning? This would be the point in the lecture where I would stop and ask you guys to give me some definition of what learning is to you. But since we don't have that luxury, I will just skip ahead to the textbook definition. Learning is defined as the process of acquiring new information through either experiences or behaviors. By doing new things, you learn how to do them. If it's a physical thing like learning to dance or ride a bike or learn to cook something maybe, we call that procedural learning, but we'll get to that later. So there are 4 ways that we learn, as you can see down here. The first one is the one we're going to concentrate on today, or this lecture at least, because I'm probably going to record more than one today. The first way we learn, the simplest way we learn, is we learn through association. And what that means is that certain events occur together in this world. If you hear a loud noise, chances are it makes you at least flinch, if not, get down on the ground. So stimuli that are not control, what does that mean? Stimuli that are not control is stimuli that are not things that you are doing specifically. Things in the world are automatically associated in your brain, and the response itself is automatic. We call this respondent behavior. When you hear something, feel something, when your brain makes a connection between 2 things in the environment, it automatically causes you to respond. So again, I go to that same idea of a balloon popping or some loud noise. It's going to cause you to startle. It's going to cause you to stop. It may cause you to freeze, right? Freezing behavior. That is in order to basically save your life, right? A lot of these things that we learn and a lot of things that are instinctual, we learn the most easily when they are threatening our life. As we've talked about through this evolutionary history, really the point of life as it's made in this primitive sense is to survive our environment. So a lot of these things we learn automatically in order to be able to survive. If we hear a roar, our ancestors, if they hear the roar of a saber-toothed tiger, they know not to go near there. So things that happen in the real world, our brain takes in automatically, and especially if it has to do with our survival, they're associated and the response is completely automatic. That's what we're going to talk about today. Also in this chapter, we also talk about we learn through consequences. we associate a response and the consequence that's learned. We call this operant conditioning, and this will be the next one. In operant conditioning, we do something, we make a behavior, and this one is not unconscious. This is totally conscious. We decide to throw something, throw a rock. And let's say our parents, this is when you're younger, you throw a rock, your parents see you, they don't like that behavior of throwing rocks at things, and you get a spanking. In the future, you are less likely to throw a rock because you got punished for that behavior and you did not like it. If you did something that was good, like your parents wanted you to eat broccoli with your dinner because broccoli is good for you and they want you to acquire good habits, then you ate your broccoli and all of a sudden, ooh, you got some ice cream for dessert. So you did a response, which was eating broccoli, and after you ate broccoli, I was going to say in response to the response, and after you ate the broccoli, you got something you liked, which was ice cream. If that action is followed by a consequence that's good, that you like, you are much more likely to do it in the future. So if eating broccoli got you ice cream, you're more likely to eat broccoli the next time. If throwing a rock got you a spanking, you are less likely to throw rocks the next time. So that's what we call operant conditioning, and as you've probably guessed, parenting is a really, really good example of it. The other ways that we learn are through acquiring mental information that guides our behavior. We call this cognitive learning. When you're writing stuff down or making mental notes or using logic from things that you learn to put concepts together and things like that. And the main guys that, the main scientists, the main guys that talked about and invented, or at least put a name to, classical and operant conditioning would try to tell you that mental information is not part of the process. They're only looking at behavior. But we see a little farther down the line that that may not exactly be true. And then finally, like I said in the third lecture, the one of the biggest ways that we learn to do things is by listening to and copying others and see how they do things. So we learn through observation. We observe what they're doing, and then we do it ourselves, whether we realize it or not. So, getting into the lesson of this lecture is called classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is the unconscious automatic form of learning. So what does that mean? It means that most of the time, if not the whole time, you don't even know that you're learning these things. So this was discovered by a man named Ivan Pavlov, but in the psychology world, it was given a name and it was made popular by a man who was influenced by Pavlov's work. And this would be John Watson. John Watson was an American in the early 1920s, and he said that the theoretical goal of science, the science of psychology, is to be able to predict and control people's behaviors. So Watson was the man, along with his counterpart, B.F. Skinner, started the subfield of behavioral psychology, or behaviorism, I should say. So when they started behaviorism, and if you remember back from the prologue, behaviorism was the dominant force in psychology for about 40 years, from about 1920 to about that cognitive revolution in 1960. The behaviorism the behaviorism scene said that psychology should be an objective science, which means that you should be able to observe it, right? Just like Wundt said, careful observation. But that number two studies behavior without reference to mental processes. So basically what Watson and eventually Skinner were saying is that all you need to know about psychology is what you can observe through behavior. You don't care about mental processes or anything like that. We don't care about emotions because we can observe everything that we need to observe. We don't care about what they're thinking. And there are two reasons behind this. For Watson, classical conditioning is completely unconscious. So you're not even aware you're learning. So what would mental processes have to do with it? What would emotions have to do with it? There is no thinking. There's only seeing if it worked or not, right? So it makes logical sense from Watson's point of view. Of course, what we know from the prologue as well, after that cognitive revolution, is that of course mental processes and thoughts and emotions are just as important. But Watson was pretty convinced that what he was saying was true. We don't care about mental processes. If it's unconscious, you're not thinking about it anyway. It's automatic. It's implicit. So most research psychologists agree with number one, that psychology should be objective. We should be able to infer from observations, but they don't agree that mental processes mean nothing. So I talk about Watson being influenced by this man named Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, so he was basically a doctor, and he was really interested in the digestive system of humans. But at that point in time, around 1900, especially in Russia, there was no doing human subjects for experiments on things like this. They barely do that now, right? I mean, obviously they have to test things out before surgeries and medications and stuff like that. But in this case, it was more conducive to study the digestive system in dogs. So that's what Pavlov was doing. Pavlov was studying a dog's digestive system, and Pavlov noticed something really interesting when he was doing that. So you can see that the dog is harnessed up so it can't move and can't get away, and that there is a tube that is attached to the dog's mouth. And what that tube is doing is collecting drops of saliva or spit, right? And what Pavlov wanted to see was what caused increasing and decreasing, and what made the dog salivate, and what caused, right, how this was involved in the whole idea of the digestive system. If he figured it out in dogs, hopefully he could figure it out pretty similarly in humans. But while he was doing this, he noticed that the dog would start drooling or salivating. I like using drooling and salivating interchangeably. Drooling is probably a term you're more familiar with. That every time he would put this food down, and it was this dry food with this meat powder on it that gave it the taste of meat, that every time he would put the food, just put the food down, the dog would start salivating. And then just hearing his footsteps to put the food down, the dog would start salivating. And this was an automatic behavior. Of course, the dog isn't thinking about it. So he was able to demonstrate what we call associative learning via salivary conditioning. He realized that automatically, when the bowl was there, when the footsteps were heard, or things like that, that the dog would automatically respond by drooling, salivating. If you're not sure why we salivate, our mouth gets, and I know people don't like the term moist, but filled with saliva when food is coming. If you didn't know why, that's because our food is being broken down, and we need to moisten it, especially if it's dry, before we can swallow and allow it to go down into our digestive tract. The reason why our mouth fills with saliva, or at least increases our salivary output, is because we start breaking down sugars and glucose right at the level of the mouth. While we're chewing and breaking down the food, it's getting converted into glucose, which is energy stored, and it goes through the blood sugar. That gets broken down and starting to get absorbed in the mouth. Then, of course, it goes down into the stomach, and we pull out the fatty acids and the proteins and things like that with the stomach acid. So that starts right away when we start chewing. So Pavlov wanted to see if he could take things like a bell or a light or a sound from a metronome, which is a thing that keeps your rhythm if you're playing an instrument, kind of like a clock, but you can speed it up and slow it down. And he wanted to basically pair those things with the food to see if the dog's brain could anticipate that food was coming. After all, just seeing the food or just hearing his footsteps served as a marker to let the dog know that food was coming. So what Pavlov did was he started with all of those things. He used a vibrating device on the dog's leg, and when it vibrated, he put the food down. He used a light. He used that metronome, which keeps it basically like a drumbeat rhythm. And of course, most famously, he used a bell, a little bell like you'd hear at the front desk of a hotel or something like that. Diddly-ling. So he would ring the bell and then put the food down. Bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food. And eventually, after about 20 times of pairing them, and of course, you had to do it each time, and he had to do it close in time. We'll get to that in a second. But every time he did that, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, eventually, after about 20 times or so, on the 21st time, let's say, for example, he just rang the bell. And what do you think happened? You're right. The dog salivated. The dog drooled, as if the food was coming. In this case, what happened was the dog's brain reliably made a connection between the bell and what was coming next. In the dog's brain, bell was paired with food, so the bell meant that food was coming, right? I think of these old Western movies where you see Ma or Pa ring the dinner bell and hit something metal against this little triangle. Billy-ling, and the kids all know to run in because it's dinner time. It's supper time, right? So that's sort of the human version of this. So the dog's brain reliably made the connection in the environment, the association between a bell and food coming. And so now reliably just ringing the bell caused the same exact response as if the actual food was there. So how does this work? Well, let's look at the basics. In basic classical conditioning, a stimulus causes an automatic reaction, and your brain is automatically doing this, so you don't even have to think about it or process it. So it's a type of learning in which one learns, one being a person or an animal, an organism, learns to link two or more stimuli together, and this makes us able to anticipate events. If that bell rings, oh, we know food is coming, and food is very important because, hey, we need to eat to survive. We also need to be scared, right? So a loud, sharp noise, like a gunshot or a balloon pop, can cause us to be at attention. It can cause our fight or flight system to automatically, at least initially, start, right? We get startled, and so we may freeze, we may jump, right? Something like that. These things are very similar. Either way, it's an automatic response. Our brain is automatically making this association, and our brain is automatically responding. So we're not even thinking about it. All right, well, let's get into this. When the bell, we'll go back to the Pavlov example with the bell and the food for the dog. When the bell rings, at first, it doesn't mean anything. The dog may turn its head in one direction or another because it hears a noise, hears a sound and doesn't know what it is or where it's coming from, so it may look around. What is that? Oh, it's a bell. Right? I mean, the dog's not going to know it's a bell, but you get it. So the bell doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean food's coming. It doesn't mean somebody's at the door the first time you hear the bell. It's just a bell. And in this case, because it has no meaning, we call it neutral. It doesn't evoke a response. So in classical conditioning, it's any stimulus that doesn't elicit any response. So the metronome, the light, the bell, before he paired it with the food, was a neutral stimulus. It didn't cause any type of response, so we call it neutral. When we pair it with something, then it becomes meaningful. It's no longer neutral. We call it a conditioned stimulus, but we'll get to that. Let's go to the food first. So we're going to skip the UR and go to the US. Any stimulus in classical conditioning that actually triggers a response, whether you mean it to or not, is called an unconditioned stimulus. So in this example with Pavlov, the bell was neutral because it didn't mean anything. It was not yet paired with anything. But what did happen every time the food was brought to the dog? When the food was put down in front of the dog naturally started salivating or drooling. Nothing happened. The brain just knew this food we need to prepare automatically to break down that food. So the food served as the unconditioned stimulus, which means that just by putting the food down, you get that automatic response of drooling. And now let's go to that response. That response is called the unconditioned response because nothing caused that response to happen except the unconditioned stimulus. Hopefully you're still following along. The food is the unconditioned stimulus because the food, just by putting it down, causes the automatic response. If there's nothing that conditioned that response, it's the unconditioned stimulus, and the response to that is also unconditioned. So just putting food down, the unconditioned stimulus, causes automatic drooling or salivating. That drooling or salivating is your unconditioned response. Now, if we wanted to train our dog, if we were Pavlov and we wanted to train our dog to salivate or to pair something up, associate something with the food, we could do that. If we took a bell, before we paired it with the food, the bell would be a neutral stimulus. But once you start ringing the bell and giving the food, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, eventually the bell signals to the dog's brain that that means food is coming, and that stimulus of the bell, once it's paired enough times, is not a neutral stimulus anymore. It starts to mean something. So it goes from a neutral stimulus, or NS, to a conditioned stimulus, or CS. Let's take a look at how this works. That initial stage of acquisition means that you're acquiring a pairing of the stimulus and the response. When one links a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. So in this case, again, bell and food. Food is unconditioned stimulus. That causes automatically the dog to salivate, which is the unconditioned response. When you pair a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, the bell and the food, then that neutral stimulus starts to trigger the conditioned response. So again, about 20 times of bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, etc. Eventually, just ringing the bell and not even presenting the food is going to cause the dog to salivate. So this becomes a, as you see kind of below, a conditioned stimulus. And it is no longer an unconditioned response if it comes from the bell. So if it comes from the food, if the drooling or the salivation comes from the food, it's an unconditioned stimulus, the food, and the response is unconditioned. Once the neutral stimulus is paired, it becomes a conditioned stimulus. So the bell now signals that food is coming. If the dog salivates to the food, it's still an unconditioned response. However, if the dog now salivates to the bell, which has been paired, the bell is now a conditioned stimulus, so the response is what we call a conditioned response, right? So again, if the response of the drooling or salivation is to the unconditioned stimulus, the food, it's an unconditioned response. But once you pair bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, and the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus, if the dog's response is to the bell and not the food, that is what we call a conditioned response. If the drooling or salivation is to the food, it is an unconditioned response because the food is an unconditioned stimulus. Hopefully you're still with me. All right. So in that phase, when you learn to pair a neutral stimulus until it becomes a conditioned stimulus, that is called acquisition. You are acquiring that pairing, that association. But what happens at that point if you just start ringing the bell a bunch of times and don't ever give the food? Well, then we get something that we call extinction. And extinction is the diminishing of that conditioned response. Eventually, if you just keep ringing that bell, ringing that bell, ringing that bell, and there's no food that comes, the dog's brain automatically knows, oh, That's not a thing anymore, right? So the whole point of the dog salivating to the bell was because the bell signaled, it meant, there was an association in the brain of the dog that meant something, that meant food was coming. Now the dog's brain knows, oh, you can ring the bell as much as you want, there's no food coming. So that response is extinguished. If you ring the bell a bunch of times but don't give food, eventually the dog will not respond. The dog will not salivate anymore to the sound of the bell if food doesn't come after it. So this is extinction. And one of the things I always ask in class is, does this mean that the dog unlearned? Or does this mean that the dog's brain just learned they are no longer paired? And the answer is the second one. There is no such thing as unlearning something. Once we learn something, could we forget? Yes. Could we learn that it's a different way than we originally learned? Hey, look at Common Core math, right? That's not the traditional way of math, but people learn that it's done a different way. So we can learn that it no longer applies in certain settings. But we cannot unlearn anything. That's not a thing. And how do we know that it means that initially our brain is making the connection and then our brain learns that they are no longer connected? Well, the way that we know that this is true is we have proof of it. We can run an experiment. And there is a thing, as you see at the bottom, called spontaneous recovery. So the definition, let's go through that first, is the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished condition response. So basically, you can go through acquisition and pair the bell and the food, bell food, bell food, bell food, and then the dog's brain learns bell means food. So we have acquired that. The bell is now successfully paired with the food and will cause the dog to salivate. Then, in phase 2, let's say the next day, you just ring the bell a bunch of times without giving the food, and on day 2, that is extinguished, right? The dog no longer responds to the bell because the bell does not mean food is coming. Day 3, let's let the dog rest. That poor dog has been through a lot with bells and food and all of that for a couple days. So day 3, dog just, gets its food. Dog doesn't have to do anything. There's no bells, anything like that. And then on day 4, first thing you do when you see the dog is ring a bell, right? Just ring a bell once. And what happens is the dog will start to drool, maybe about half of as much as it did before. And then right away, the dog's brain realizes, oh, wait, that's not a thing anymore. And the response is gone again. So just that little reappearance, just that little bit of drooling on day 4 after it's been already extinguished, it's like the dog's brain is like, oh, wait, that's not a thing anymore. So just that brief reappearance of the extinguished response, drooling or salivation, shows that the brain had some sort of memory for it. And then realized right away, oh wait, that's not a thing anymore. That is your proof. This is called spontaneous recovery, and that is your actual proof that we don't unlearn. The dog's brain automatically learned that bell was paired with food, and then during extinction, the dog's brain learned that those two things are no longer paired. That's not a thing anymore. So here's what this would look like on a chart. We start with a weak stimulus, neutral stimulus. It means nothing. Just a bell by itself doesn't mean anything. Again, dog's head may swirl around because it hears a sound and is like, what is that? But not going to do anything. That is your neutral stimulus. Of course, the unconditioned stimulus is always going to be strong, right? That's something that reliably signals. Something that we know automatically, food, things that keep us safe, stuff like that are really good unconditioned stimuli because we need those for survival. So at the beginning of this, you have a very weak response. Looking at on the bottom, it's the amount of time or number of times you pair it. And the response on the left-hand side, very low on this chart, is weak or no response. And high up on the chart is a very strong response. So initially you have the bell, which is neutral. You have the food, which is the unconditioned stimulus. If there is any drooling or salivation going on, it is to the food at this point, so it is an unconditioned response. Eventually, you start pairing here. Bell food, bell food, bell food, bell food, bell food. At the beginning, at that first dotted line, we'll call that the end of day one. Just ringing the bell has now become a conditioned stimulus, or CS. And if the dog is drooling to just the sound of the bell, that is a conditioned response. So by the end of day one, you ring a bell and the dog will salivate just as much as it did when you just gave the food. Eventually, on day two, now you just start ringing the bell by itself, but not giving any food. So you only have the conditioned stimulus of the bell, and you are not giving any food. Eventually, after a bunch of times ringing the bell and no food coming, the dog's brain realizes those two things are no longer associated. So the response drops very quickly back down to zero. By the end of day two, this is what we call extinction. You just play the conditioned stimulus, and now it is no longer conditioned, it goes back to neutral because there is no response. After a brief pause, this could be day three, this could be part of day three, doesn't really matter, you do nothing, and you just leave the dog be. And then the fourth day, you ring the bell once and you see about half the strength of a response that extinguishes again really quickly, because the dog's brain goes, oh, wait a minute, those things are not associated anymore, you tricked me. So that spontaneous recovery, that little bit of a response after it's been extinguished, shows that the brain still had a memory that they were once paired together. And that memory quickly fades, and the brain says, wait, sorry, that's not a thing anymore, I forgot. So just that little spontaneous recovery reappearance of the conditioned response shows that we don't unlearn things. We learn automatically that it's paired, and then we learn that they are no longer paired. Obviously, I have provided the classical conditioning Pavlov experiment video for you with this, so you can watch that, and hopefully that can help you to understand. We would normally watch this, of course, in the confines of me explaining this. So that is the basic concepts of classical conditioning. But there was one other thing, well, two other things really, as you can see from this slide, that Pavlov discovered as he was perfecting this idea of classical conditioning. And that is that things that are is the tendency, once the response has been conditioned, for similar stimuli, or stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus, to elicit similar responses. So what does this mean? What this means is, let's go back to the example I've been using of as a bell. If you pair the bell with the food, then the dog's brain understands it's the bell. And any sort of bell that probably sounds really close to the original bell will still give a similar response. It may not be completely as strong as the actual bell, but it will still cause a response, because our brain can understand things that are similar may mean the same thing, right? And this is an automatic response. We don't have to process any of this consciously. So how can I give you an example of this? Well, that's pretty easy. So we paired bell food, bell food, bell food, and the bell sounds like this, right? So anything that sounds close to that chime of the bell may cause the dog to also salivate. So I know this is 1900s in Russia for Pavlov, but bear with me for a second. I'm going to try to bring us into the future a little bit. Let's just pretend that bicycle bells, like you may have on your bike, like my son has on his bike, fring, 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 that those were a thing back then. And let's say that somebody came over to Pavlov's house, one of his friends, and he wanted Pavlov to go on a bike ride with him. So while Pavlov has just conditioned, this is day one acquisition, Pavlov has just conditioned his dog to salivate to the bell. Diddling, and all of a sudden, Pavlov's friend comes to the front door and goes, "Vring, vring, vring, vring. Hey, Pavlov, come on a bike ride with me." All of a sudden, just the ringing of that bicycle bell, vring, vring, is going to cause the dog to start drooling or salivating. This is what we call generalization. Obviously, in 1900 in Russia, they didn't have doorbells either. Ding dong. But maybe the ding dong of a doorbell, if they had one, would also be close to that bell and simulate, right? And be close to that stimulus. So let's say it's not a bicycle bell and somebody just came to Pavlov's house and they wanted to come in and hang out and they ring the doorbell. Ding dong. Hey, Pavlov, I'm here, right? Just the sound of that bell, the doorbell, ding dong, might also cause the dog to salivate. Maybe not as much as the diddling, but close. So anything that is close to that bell, a bicycle bell, ring, ring, a doorbell, ding dong, right? Those will cause a generalization response. Similar responses, maybe not as much salivation as the actual bell itself, but close, because in reality, we know that things that sound, right? It doesn't need to be a gunshot. It could be a balloon pop. It could be any sort of loud noise that is still going to automatically elicit a startle reflex. We will get startled or scared. Discrimination is the other thing that Pavlov realized, because our brains know that if it's similar enough, it's probably related, but if it's nowhere near, we're not going to respond the same way. In the same way our brain can tell the difference between similar sounds or similar stimuli, it can also tell when stimuli are not similar. So discrimination is defined as the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus, like a bell, and other irrelevant stimuli. So what this means is, if you condition a bell with the food, shining a light in the dog's eyes is not going to cause a response. Playing a metronome is not going to cause that drooling response. Anything else that has not been paired, that doesn't sound like a bell, that doesn't generalize, is not going to cause a response, because not only can our brain understand things that are similar, it can also understand when things are not the same, right? So in this same example that we're going with, right, generalization shows that if you pair the food with a bell, ding, or a bike bell, ring, 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 or a doorbell, ding dong, those things will still potentially cause generalization, and the dog will respond at least a little bit. Discrimination could be, at that time, even automobiles were pretty scarce, but I don't know if you know this, but before horns sounded like they do today, and some people can't take their hands off of them, they used to sound, a car horn used to sound like this, auga, right? Now that doesn't sound anything like a bell, right? Auga does not sound like diddling. So Pavlov's friend comes over on a bike, vring, 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 up, dog drools a little bit. Somebody rings Pavlov's doorbell to come in, or to let him know they're there, ding dong, then the dog will still salivate. But if somebody's outside saying, "Hey, Pavlov, we got to get down to the blah, 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 ooga, come on out," the dog will not salivate or drool to the sound of the car horn, because it doesn't sound anything like a bell. The dog's brain has been able to discriminate that low car horn sound, ooga, is not a bell. So our brain can generalize things that are very similar, and our brain also knows when things are not similar. This is the idea of generalization and discrimination. So how were those two things in the original experiment shown? Well, they weren't shown in the original experiment. Pavlov used a metronome, Pavlov used light, Pavlov used famously a bell, and the other thing I told you was that he used a vibrating device. So basically he put a little vibrating device on the dog that caused a vibration response. In a follow-up experiment, Pavlov took a bunch of these vibrating devices and put them on different parts of the dog. So what he did was, he demonstrated by attaching these miniature vibrating devices to the various parts of a dog's body. And at first, in order to get acquisition, he used only one specific part of the body that he stimulated or vibrated to get the response. Very much like the bell, only this time it's just a buzzing feeling on your body. What you see from the chart on the left is on the bottom, the different areas where he attached a vibrating device. And on the left, you see the numbers that show the drops of saliva. So the more drops of saliva, the more response of that drooling response, right? Or salivating response. So you see he attached the miniature vibrators to the various parts of the dog's body. At the top, the biggest part of the line, the peak around 52, is the thigh. Part of the body stimulated, the thigh. Thigh seems to be the biggest one, right? That's because that's where Pavlov actually stimulated and caused that acquisition phase. So in this case, the neutral stimulus was a vibrating sensation. And of course, he paired that with food. So he conditioned salivation to stimulation of the thigh. Then he attached the other vibrating devices, and he wanted to see what the response would be like for the different parts of the body where he attached these vibrating devices. And what you see is, this was a few years later, the closer a stimulated spot was to the thigh, the stronger the response, the more salivation. The farther away it was from the thigh, the less response or more discrimination. So here we see that when it was, when the thigh was vibrated or stimulated, you got the most drool, 52 drops of saliva or something like that. Next was the pelvis, which is really close to the thigh, right? Pelvis is like the bone right next to the thigh. When the pelvis was stimulated, you still got almost the same response, about 49 drops of saliva. When the shoulder, which is close, the trunk, which is close to the pelvis and thigh, was stimulated, you still got about a pretty strong response, about 40 drops. But the farther away that it got from the thigh, the hind paws in the back, about 32 drops of saliva. And as you got to the shoulders and forelegs and front paws, which are far away from the thighs, the farther away you went from where it was stimulated, the more discrimination, meaning the less response. It was still the same type of stimulation, which was vibration, but the farther away from the point where it was conditioned, the less response you got. So the farther away, the more discrimination. The closer you got, the more generalization. This is how Pavlov showed these two concepts of generalization and discrimination. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that the consensus among psychologists is that classical conditioning is unconscious or implicit, as we learned from chapter 3, and it seems to be the most basic form of learning, where we have to understand sometimes what the meaning of things are that we learn, using that mental guidance. Remember, cognitive learning. We have to make it understand the association or understand if something is rewarding or not, right? In this case, we have no thinking necessary. And this is exactly why Watson said we don't need thought processes, because in this case, the stimulus that we learn is automatic. Our brain automatically learns that a loud noise means a scared, startled response. It automatically learns that a bell means food is coming. And these things are automatic. In the same breath, our response to them is automatic. We're not telling ourselves consciously, oh, we're going to be scared if we hear a loud noise. No, our brain hears the loud noise, connects it with danger, and causes an automatic response of being startled. For the dog's automatic response is, I'm going to start salivating or drooling. The dog is not thinking, oh, I better drool now so I can break down this food. You probably didn't even realize that we do this to break down food until I just mentioned it a few minutes ago. So the consensus among psychologists is that this is the most basic form of learning, and of course it's tied to survival, as we've talked about in an evolutionary sense, because we need to act quickly, and in this case automatically from our brain, implicitly, unconsciously, in order to be able to have the best chance of survival. One of the other things that I didn't mention that I should mention now is that in order to reliably acquire this for acquisition, is that the response has to be within a couple seconds of the stimulus. Meaning, if I were to pair a bell with food, and you've heard me say this over and over, bell food, bell food, bell food, I'm doing it right away. And that's on purpose. Because what would happen if I said, oh, let me ring the bell, and then we wait. Oh, now we give food. Or maybe a minute later we give food. Is that enough time, close enough for the brain to understand that those two things are related or connected? No, it's not, right? You ring a bell and then 2 minutes later you bring food. That's not going to cause acquisition. Or if it does, it's going to be a lot slower than maybe 20 times. So it needs to reliably signal it right away for the brain to make a connection between things in the environment. We don't hear a loud noise and then like 2 minutes later get that startle response, right? So we know that it's not just food, but many other responses to many other stimuli, especially if it is important to your survival, can be classically conditioned in many organisms. So Pavlov was able to demonstrate how this learning process can be studied objectively. And to much to Watson's happiness, much to his delight, he said that you don't even have to have any mental processes for this. The brain's doing it automatically. It's unconscious. So what the general consensus is today is that classical conditioning is a basic form of learning that applies to all species. If they hear something, feel something, and it is associated with food or associated with danger, they will learn to adapt. This is part of this evolutionary process, how humans and other animals learn to adapt to a changing environment. So we know that these principles are used to influence learning, but they're also used to influence human health, well-being, happiness, right? Learning to associate things that are happy, especially in these times. So areas of consciousness, and this is an unconscious process. Motivation, what makes us motivated for things. Emotions, things that are associated with happiness versus sadness versus being scared, like a loud noise. In areas of health, we learn to associate things that are good for our health. A lot of times, stress triggers bad eating, right? Especially in these times. So a stress response, something stressful, may cause us to crave bad foods or things like that, because that's how we deal with that. Psychological disorders can be brought up, right? One of the things we're going to talk about in the last chapter is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. That can be caused just by hearing a shot or something traumatic, hearing a car crash or things like that. And we can also use it in therapy to try to get people to extinguish certain responses that are negative. My example of it in class, should we have met face to face, would have been thinking about, since a lot of you guys, not all of you, were in high school fairly recently, that the bell rings a lot to signal the classes start, classes end, it's lunchtime, things like that. But it's that last bell of the day, which is usually around, I guess, 3 o'clock. We're like, okay, start class, stop class, lunchtime, go back to class. But that last bell of the day may have given you a little giddiness, a little pep in your step, a little shot of adrenaline. And it was that last bell of the day that you were classically conditioned to get a little bit of happiness. So you can see where it might work with emotions, right? As I just pointed out. A lot of people think that drugs and the addiction that develops, as we talked about at the end of chapter 3, that addictive response and the craving of the drugs would be an operant conditioning response. And I can see how that would be, right? You take the drug, which is a physical conscious decision. The drug makes you feel good. And in response, you take more of the drug in the future because it made you feel good. So it's very easy to think that drugs and addiction might be an operant conditioning response. But remember what I talked about in chapter 3 with drugs, is that eventually your brain spikes dopamine not in response to the drug, but before you take the drug, which causes that craving response. And guess what? That craving response and that spike of dopamine is an automatic brain process, right? So, although it may be understandable to think that drug addiction, or at least just doing drugs before you're addicted, is an operant conditioning response, and I would tend to say yes, doing the drugs before you're addicted is an operant conditioning. You act it out. The consequence is you feel better if you're taking that drug most of the time, right? It makes you feel good. That's why people do it. And then because it makes you feel good, you're more likely to do it in the future. So that's true when you first start doing it. But addiction is an automatic process. Your brain automatically says, okay, we haven't had the drug in enough time. So it spikes dopamine into that reward center of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. And automatically what happens from that is you have this automatic behavior of craving the drug. In that case, drug addiction is actually a classical conditioning response. Addicts, in this case, if we are trying to help people to get over their addiction to things, addicts are counseled to avoid stimuli that may trigger cravings. So, as we sort of talked about, or as I talked about in chapter 3, an alcoholic may get that response simply by walking past the bar or driving past the bar where you do most of your drinking, or in your drug chair, drug den, whatever it is. So a lot of times, even if it means that you're going to be a lot, it's going to take a lot longer to get to work or school or things like that, counselors always try to tell people, if the way that you go includes the bar where you were always drinking, that's what can trigger this response. So in order to avoid this classical conditioning response, drive the other way, even if it takes a lot longer to get there. We also know that pairing particular tastes with drugs that influences immune response may eventually lead to that response just from the taste alone. So in trying to get people to quit drinking, I think I mentioned in chapter 3, there is a medication or drug called Antabuse. And if I didn't, I'll mention it here. Antabuse, I'm pretty sure I mentioned it though. Antabuse is a drug or a medication that causes the alcohol to not metabolize, which means you don't get the fun drunken inebriation feeling. What it does do is it makes the hangover part worse. So takes away the good and only gives you the bad stuff, right? So basically you drink and drink and drink after you take Antabuse, and the next morning you feel like absolute hell. You're hungover, it's hard to get up, your head hurts a lot, the world sucks, but you never got the fun drunken part from it. And much like being averse to food, remember in chapter 6, we talked about taste aversion. And I talked about my Cool Ranch Doritos adventure. Hopefully, the pairing of the bad hangover stuff and none of the good, fun, drunk feelings will cause your addiction to go away, because it pairs that unpleasant feeling with the drinking. And that is a classical conditioning response. Trying to, anything that makes you sick and is negative, hopefully it'll get you to avoid that. So it'll get you to stop the drinking type of behavior. So you've probably noticed by now that we've gotten pretty far in this lecture without talking about the actual guy who invented behaviorism, John Watson. We talked about the original concept so that you could get it, but Pavlov actually famously hated psychology. He thought it was a bunch of mumbo jumbo. He was big on medicine, and I think I made mention of this at the very beginning of class, that when you okay, now I forgot where I was going with that, but that basically, we'll come back to that if I remember. But Pavlov did not he thought psychology was just a bunch of mumbo jumbo. He liked the medical aspect, right? Oh, I think I remember where I was going with that. That if you walked into a doctor's office before the 1900s and you were to say, I have this weird mental health problem, I'm feeling anxious or depressed or whatever they would, if they didn't even have a name for it back then, but I'm feeling like I have problems mentally, but not physically. And the doctor would say, well, what are the physical symptoms? And you say, no, no, no. I was just saying mentally. I'm fine physically. I have no problem physically. I'm just mentally out of it. The doctor would say, get out of my office. Nothing's wrong with you. Because they never were able to separate mental health from physical health. So Pavlov, although he did develop this psychological concept, did not like psychology and thought it was a bunch of hogwash. So he was in the medical field, so it makes sense around this time. So John Watson took what Pavlov said and what he discovered and said, that, you know, people said that's all well and good that you showed this in a dog. And back then we did not have comparative studies because people did not know that the brains of dogs and other lower animals were similar to humans. So a lot of people said, well, that's all well and good. He showed this in a dog, but what does that have to do with human behavior? After all, a dog is very different from a human. So Watson was one of the first to say, no, no, we can actually show this same concept in humans. And of course, all of these people were skeptical and said, well, prove it. And he said, if you give me a child, give me a human child, I can show you that we can condition things just like Pavlov conditioned the dog. And so Pavlov's work provided this basis for Watson's ideas that human emotions and human behaviors, although they're biologically influenced, are mainly just the same thing that Pavlov discovered, conditioned responses. Again, I gave you an example. You get a little bit happy, a little giddy, get a little pep in your step when that last bell rings and you're no longer stuck in your school, right? So Pavlov said, well, let me design an experiment with a child to show you exactly that. And so what happened is Watson used this little kid, his name was little Albert, and I provided the video for this as well, to demonstrate how specific fears might be conditioned. So I don't have a slide for this, but in the little Albert experiment, basically what you'll see is that Watson took a little baby, about 6 months old, maybe a year old, I forget, and he put this baby in, sat him down, and he brought these little animals around him. So different types of animals. First, it was a dog, a white rabbit, a little white rat, which Albert really seemed to like. And all of these animals he got to play with and touch, and it was kind of pleasant. Kids usually, without any, established relationships, good or bad, tend to like animals. It's a happy feeling, for the most part. So he even brought things like a seal fur coat and a Santa Claus mask, which may or may not have looked a little scary. You guys be the judge of that on the video. But all of these things kind of made little Albert kind of happy, and he kind of liked them, right? You like petting animals and things like that. We like introducing animals to babies. It's cute. Animals these days, as you guys probably know, are used as therapy and emotional support, especially dogs. So Albert really liked these animals at first. And then Watson had a giant metal bar and a hammer behind little Albert. And eventually, when he brought the dog back around to little Albert, as soon as little Albert reached to touch the dog, Watson struck the loud bar, the big metal bar, with a hammer, making a very very loud, unpleasant bong sound, which scared the baby. Of course, little Albert was startled, so it was meant to cause that startle reflex, like if we hear a loud noise. So anytime, whenever the dog was around, or whenever little Albert reached for the dog, bong, that bar was struck, and it caused a fear response in little Albert. eventually, and the nice thing from a research standpoint, because you don't want to do too much damage, especially to humans. I mean, you don't want to do damage to animals either, is that aversive or negative things, you don't need to do them as often, right? You don't need to pair it 20 times for the salivation and the food and the bell. You only need to hit that bar and startle the kid a couple times for that response to sink in. So he did that, and all of a sudden, little Albert started to cry. That was the automatic response. A little while later, he brought just the sight of the dog caused little Albert to start crying. And remember, we talked about those ideas of generalization and discrimination. So basically, everything that Albert saw, the white rat, the dog, the rabbit, anytime that the association was made, any animal caused little Albert to be scared. Even the seal fur coat and the Santa mask caused little Albert to have that same automatic response of crying, because it was associated with the really loud, scary noise. So what this showed was, not only does it work for a dog in salivation, but it works for humans as well. And again, these things like phobias to certain things, being afraid of heights or afraid of snakes or things like that, could merely be classically conditioned associations and responses that's happening automatically. So if somebody has claustrophobia and they can't be in an enclosed space like an elevator with too many people, that could have been something that was classically conditioned in them, and they developed that phobia. So that's what Watson sort of brought in. So let's practice. Down. And even though the fan has left a long time ago, maybe they got too drunk, who knows, you still have that wincing response. And as I'm actually saying this, I'm doing this, I'm pantomiming this wince. So the question I ask you, and actually for the first assignment that will be due this Sunday, the question is, what is the unconditioned stimulus in this example? What is the unconditioned response? What is the conditioned stimulus? And what is the conditioned response? Well, the unconditioned stimulus would be the team scoring a touchdown. Now, normally when your team, if you're a sports fan, your team scores, your automatic response, without really thinking about it much, is to cheer, right? In this case, the unconditioned stimulus is the touchdown. What's the unconditioned response? Well, the unconditioned response would, I'm sorry, let's try this again. The unconditioned stimulus in this case is going to be the air horn, because whenever the air horn is loud and played near your ear, it causes you to do that wincing behavior. The unconditioned stimulus is the air horn. The unconditioned response is for you to wince. Are you still with me? Sorry, I got screwed up in my own head. The unconditioned stimulus is the air horn, which automatically causes you to wince and cringe. The conditioned stimulus is what's paired with the air horn. So what causes the air horn to go off is the touchdown. So at first, a touchdown doesn't mean much in the confines of this game, but if that touchdown causes the fan to blow the horn, right, eventually the touchdown is your conditioned stimulus. It goes from neutral, not meaning much other than 6 points, with the possibility of 7 or 8 with the extra points. But when it is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the horn, it becomes conditioned. So now a touchdown causes the horn to blow, and that causes you to wince. The unconditioned stimulus is the horn. The unconditioned response is you wincing or, flinching. Conditioned stimulus is the touchdown, which is paired with the horn, which means what's the conditioned response? When just the touchdown causes you to wince, as if the horn will be played. So even at the end, when the person with the horn has left, just the touchdown may cause you to wince because your brain has automatically associated it with the horn. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. But you guys will get a chance to practice this on your own. That is the end of this classical conditioning lecture. And when I come back for the next video, we will talk about what we see here in operant conditioning. So let that classical conditioning lesson sink in, and I will talk to you soon.